Now, broadcasting on Radio Star Worldwide, it's time for Dr. Rademakers' Prescription for Transformation. Let's tap into your own authentic genius and live the life you desire.
You are now listening to...
Join Dr. Rademaker for an enlightened conversation about our brain intelligence, our body intelligence, and our energy intelligence. And now, here's your host, Dr. Bart Rademaker.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Bart Rademaker, your host today for Prescription for Transformation, as well as hashtag real people, hashtag real conversations. And it's all about that intelligence around us. We always talk about the intelligence. And to have an intelligent life also means that things are not just happening by random. And today, I have to be totally honest with you. I am so wired. And I don't know if it's the cosmic energy, and you'll understand what I mean by that later on in the show, or it's just that person that's going to be joining us today. And remember that the platform that we're talking about is the platform of our human experience. You know, what it is that makes us human. And again, are you going to be that accidental tourist in your own life, bumping into things that excite you and inspire you? Or are you going to be that purposeful tour guide that you will decide and define and design your own life? And getting access to some of the most phenomenal tools out there. And again, today is no exception. And it's really interesting for me because I had an amazing conversation with this gentleman, and it totally blew me away. And it's going to blow you away too. And what I really got out of it for me was that I now had permission to be me. And you'll find out what that really means. And it was from an unlikely source. I didn't think this would actually be possible, but you will see that it totally is. And having that human experience, having that human existence, you know, what is that really? Is there a purpose? Is there a mission for you? Is there a design that you have? And as we tap into the understanding that we also live in rhythms, short rhythms for milliseconds to seconds to minutes to hours, days, weeks, and centuries and cycles. And that's what today is really all about. It's about timing. Is your timing right on? And I'm incredibly excited to be talking to Mr. Larry Martin, astrology. And I'm going to let him tell us a little bit about himself because I really want to make sure you get to know what an incredible person this is. Welcome, Larry.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bart. It's really a pleasure to share this with you as well as, you know, with all the listeners because, you know, I myself, you know, grew up interested in psychology and interested in sociology and interested in human beings, but was really curious about astrology and the pyramids and, you know, how life worked and what is cosmology. In other words, how do we fit in and what happens when we die? In other words, just asking what is the purpose to all this. So as you can imagine, I was a troublesome teenager, always asking the questions of why this and why that. So it always opens doors of adventure. I think anytime we ask questions and we persist at finding the answer. So whether we're journeying through school or college or life itself, you know, as a school, we're constantly opening doors by simply asking questions. So as far as, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. And of course, it's also about asking the right question. And so that's what today is also really all about is, you know, where do we fit in this existence, in this world, in this universe, in this galaxy? You know, how much of that is really, you know, predictable? How much, you know, what is this idea of, you know, cosmic energy and planet alignments and cycles and locational astrology, stuff that, you know, you rarely even hear of, But in a sense, you're also predicting the future. So if you could ask the right questions, then you could start predicting what's going to happen. Is that right?
Well, to some extent, yes. It seems to be that throughout the ages of time, especially going all the way back to ancient Greece or even Egypt, they believed that biology and cosmology were one and the same. They were synonymous, that there was an interconnection between the earth and all the beings living on it. And when you start seeing things as being interconnected instead of separate, it changes your whole perspective on life itself. So when we're talking about timing, we're paying respect to the speed of the rotation of the earth. We're paying respect to the stars rising, the planets moving, and our question of where is it that we fit in. When I was a teenager, I walked into a metaphysical bookstore, and I think there's a few of those still in existence. And a gentleman there actually produced my astrological birth chart, in other words, a map, if you would, of when I was born, down to the minute. And it was a representation of all the planets that we knew of at the time in our solar system. And it was unique to me. That was the fascinating part about it. And he spent all of maybe 8 seconds telling me when my parents divorced a couple of years ago, down to the month. And I was stunned. I was just amazed. Like, wow, what kind of magic trick is this? And as he explained to me what the map was that he was reading, I realized, wow, that moment in time that I was born is kind of my map. It's my place in the cosmology of things. It's my place in the universe, because only another baby born within 4 minutes would have the same chart. And that's where I think a lot of people lose what astrology really means, is because they think of that map as being disconnected or separate from ourselves. So we do have this understanding of time, and it really does interweave into our society. A lot of people have heard of the Farmer's Almanac, or they know of a man named Benjamin Franklin, so many hundreds of years ago, who wrote his own almanac. In other words, where the planets were going to be, where the moon was going to be. And they would decide when to plant the seeds and when to harvest the gardens. And they would literally respect the idea of changing seasons and would act appropriately in order to get the best yield on their crop. They never once thought of it as, magic or some kind of illusionary trick. They felt it was all quite natural. And being in the right place at the right time can be designated by these maps. And they're not that difficult to read, and they're certainly not difficult to reproduce anymore with today's internet and computers. We can create an entire star map in just a fraction of a second.
And you did that for me as well. And later on in the show, I'm going to ask you to describe some of your findings, and also some findings of other people. So really, what you're saying, contrary to popular belief, is that there's truly a science behind this, that computers can generate really clear answers.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, that's where astrology sometimes meets its critics, is because it uses scientific principles, mathematics, astronomy, physics, to explain and create first and then explain these maps. And scientists believe that, yes, while you can use all of these tools to generate these maps, they believe the maps are disconnected and mean nothing. But the astrology then kind of branches off as an art. In other words, it's not meant to reproduce these charts and have some kind of scientific experiment prove its validity. It's more like understanding that each of these maps are a unique moment in time, and that you're born, everyone's born at a unique moment in time. So we really don't apply to the scientific method because we can't reproduce you. We can't reproduce the experiment. So these unique moments in time have a variety of expressions. They have a variety of archetypes. For those of you that have studied Jungian psychology, these archetypes come alive from the map, and they tell stories. And they tell stories that mimic one's own personality and even begin to describe the timing of your birth and what was going on at the time. And then as we age, as we move forward, we're aging at the same rate of time that's passing here on Earth. So we are subject to the changing seasons and the planets as they change their cycles and change their times. And we grow through different ages or stages of development. And most of us seem to change these stages right on time, as if we were always meant to do this. So it's not in the more Newtonian sense of where people think planets are doing things to us. They're certainly not, or at least not that we can perceive. But they're more like hands on a clock. It's interesting, all the different arguments I'll hear now and again where people will say, well, I don't believe in astrology. And I said, well, it's nothing that really requires belief, no more so than the wristwatch on your arm requires belief. It's like saying, oh, well, it's 12 o'clock, therefore we must eat lunch. Well, no, 12 o'clock is simply a time you may have agreed to eat lunch, but it isn't 12 o'clock making you hungry. In other words, we have a beautiful natural system of watching the sunrise and the sunset exactly at a given minute or even a given second, depending on your measurement of time. And we know when the seasons begin and end, even though some people in parts of the country may be experiencing odd weather at different times. But it's all predictable because we know when the next minute will arrive. We know when the next hour is due. So it's not fortune telling, as some people might call it. It's simply explaining to people how cycles repeat themselves and what's to occur next. We can look at the clock and say, oh, it's 5 o'clock Eastern time. Well, we know with 100% accuracy that an hour from now it'll be 6 o'clock Eastern time. So there's nothing about it that's magical, except to the people that are unfamiliar.
So let me see if I understand it, and please correct me, if I get this wrong.
Sure.
And the way that I've chosen to interpret this is simply this: is that our entire space is energy. Everything is some form of energy, some sort of vibration, some sort of harmonic. Yeah. And when you look at all the arrangement of all the planets and the stars and everything else, they all have some sort of impact on something else. It's just like, we talk about the butterfly effect. We talk about ripples going through and having effects, somewhere else. A splash here creates a hurricane somewhere else. And so in essence, because there's this complex, conglomeration of planets and energies that's in some form of cycle, in some form of rhythm. And depending on where you show up within that cycle is kind of sort of the path that you're going to live throughout your entire life. Obviously not a totally predictive aspect of what's going to happen to you, but to a large extent, as you described with your parents, that things will happen. So would that be an accurate way of describing it?
Yes. In fact, probably another way of looking at it would be to consider consciousness as a commodity. In other words, that the greater the level of consciousness, the greater the level of awareness the person has, the more free will they have. And to the other end of the spectrum, the less aware you are of your environment and your surroundings, the more you may blame fate, for the circumstances in your life. So if we are to raise our level of consciousness, let's say, and be more aware of our environment, we may start out with very simple things like knowing what season it is on the calendar or knowing what time of day it is on a clock. Well, the ancient Greeks used to believe that we were so interconnected that the planets themselves were more like gods. In fact, they named them such. And what they felt was that if you were able to be born, blessed, as it were, to be able to look into the eyes of a god, that god would bestow all their gifts upon you. So I thought, along with a lot of other people, few years back. Well, what if that was literally true? In other words, what if you were born at a certain hour right as Venus was rising or as Mars was rising? You would be looking at them right in the eye because they would be on the horizon. Just as you or I might look up at stars or look up at planets as they move across the sky, we would be looking at them eye to eye if they were on the horizon. So this is where we find location to also be important. In other words, when I was born at night, about 10 o'clock at night. And in the Midwestern state of Ohio, Venus had already sat on the horizon about 2 hours prior to my birth. So there was no way for me to actually look Venus in the eye. And I noticed that while I was living in Ohio, my love life was terrible, business was cumbersome, struggles occurred all over, and luck was something I just couldn't afford. So the thought was, if I could change time and get those 2 hours back, maybe Venus would look me in the eye. So, as most people would cringe, wondering, well, how can you change time? How can you change your birth time? I said, well, quite easily by today's standards. In other words, what do we do to move the clock backwards? Well, we move west, don't we? We get on a jet and we fly from, let's say, New York to Chicago or New York to LA. We're changing time when we do this, aren't we? You know, it's not the exact same hour in one place as it is another. Depends on which way the Earth is facing the sun. So for me, relocating to Arizona moves the clock exactly backwards 2 hours so that Venus indeed would be looking at my eyes. It'd be right on the horizon. Same with the idea of where we were talking about your chart, Bart, and the idea that you're born in Europe. By moving west to North America, you're essentially turning the clock back and changing Jupiter from being in a relatively unimportant location to being exactly dead square in your career area of the map. And the location to do that, or the distance to move west, would be in the state of Florida in the United States. So does that mean that Florida is magical for you or that you must live in Florida? No. It's simply showing by using computer technology and simple mathematics that turning the clock backwards, as it were, puts Jupiter at an angle that benefits your career. So again, it's a matter of education as well as a level of consciousness. Now, you might say subconsciously you somehow were attracted to Florida and you simply moved there on your own. But hopefully you would also be aware of, hey, I'm seemingly finding success much more easily. I seem to be in the right place at the right time. What's nice about the astrology is it's an objective scientific measurement of tools to literally show you objectively on paper that you're in the right place at the right time.
And that, I think, is magical. And because it actually gives you that freedom to make smarter choices for yourself, and then actually really live the life that you desire, living the life, by design. And so that's what's exciting.
It's very exciting. It's almost as though it's like one of the best kept secrets because, what I call real astrology as it's practiced by, a few hundred people here in the United States. And we actually have national conventions and we have world conventions and we have groups and conferences and all kinds of get-togethers to learn from one another because it's not and doesn't really have anything to do with horoscopes as people understand them, sun sign columns. Those are usually just entertainment writings to help some of us make a living in some cases. But it's very general. It's very vague. Your unique birth time and your unique astrology map, no one else can really share with you. Even if you have a twin, the twin born outside that 4-minute window is going to have a different map. It's going to have a different chart. And then your experience, your level of consciousness, your level of education, your culture that you're brought up with, your parents' their influence upon you, or whoever raised you. All of that works together to make up, who you are. And finding a piece of paper, as it were, to literally demonstrate your significance shows that all of us have a place here in the world, and we're all interconnected by these things. We're not separate. And understanding that connectedness is what becomes even more fascinating. And I've literally made it my life's work to study this and be skeptical and not just take someone's word for it, but to do a lot of investigation on my own.
Talking about being, skeptical, and I really, appreciate and respect, your approach, with that skepticism, because, a lot of people look at this, very skeptically, and because you are good at that, you're going to make sure that the information that's delivered is so incredibly accurate that there is no question about it. And everyone that I've ever talked to about this, and people that I have a very high regard for, have all said the same thing very consistently. This guy is right on. And what's interesting is that sometimes the response is, well, you know what? I mean, does that mean that my life is already written down? And that's kind of scary. And the truth is that it gives you that even more freedom of choice. And I like one of these statements that you put on your website, which, by the way, is larrymartin.biz, is acceptance is not a compromise, but a strategy. And so knowing this kind of information, you can actually just deliver a life which is much more on purpose. And
right.
Very specifically in the areas that you also talk about, which I believe is relationships, it's career, it's money, and things like that. And so I'd like to go into that shortly after the break. We're not going to go on the break quite yet, but what is oftentimes the reaction that you do get from people, and how is it? I'd like to hear a story from you, how people are just blown away by the information that you give them.
Well, ironically, it's the more skeptical people, or people that have never had their chart written before or read before, that are the most astonished, because they have either been convinced or have decided without information to prejudge and think of it as fortune telling or a parlor trick or it's a magician's sleight of hand. And those are the easiest charts to read, because people seldom will drift off their path if they don't know they're on one. And yet people that have had their chart read consistently year after year and who are very self-aware, they sometimes have the most difficult chart to read, simply because their level of awareness has given them so much choice. They've been able to choose times with which to zig or zag, and have been able to literally even change their destiny. Or as people in India might speak, they might say, well, you can change your karma the more you know about your chart, which I absolutely believe is true.
Wow. So I'm Dr. Bart Rademaker, Prescription for Your Transformation, real people, real conversation, talking to an amazing human being, and almost a predictor of your future using science so that you can make better decisions for yourself, Mr. Larry Martin. We will continue right after the break talking about how specifically we can design, or you can find out how it affects your career, your relationships, and your ability to earn money right after this break.
We'll be back with Dr. Rademaker right after these. It's people's secrets that make them interesting. People have been trusting their secrets to longtime business journalist Judy Schreiner for the last 25 years. And now you can hear them too on Radio Star Worldwide every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. So have you been to the Horse and Cow yet? The Horse and Cow is a bar that caters to the submariner fleets and has been doing it for over 60 years. They've been in San Diego, San Francisco, Bremerton, and Guam. Today, they are famous for their burgers and hot wings and their signature drink, New Quaist. On their show, they talk with the brewing houses and distillers, liquor distributors, and patrons of the Horse and Cow. Yes, the Horse and Cow has a reputation for being an off-the-hook bar for submariners. But everyone is welcome, so pull up a chair and join the fun. And if you can't make it to the Horse and Cow Live, listen every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern right here on Radio Star Worldwide. It's happy hour at the Horse and Cow. Welcome back to Dr. Rademacher's Prescription for Transformation. And now, once again, your host, Dr. Bart Rademacher.
Welcome. And I'm Dr. Bart Rademacher, Prescription for Your Transformation, having an absolutely fascinating conversation with Mr. Larry Martin, Astrology. And you can find him on www.larrymartin.biz. And he's got some incredible information on his website. He's got events. If you want to know more about you and increase your conscious awareness of where you fit in this human experience of yours, go to his website. And I'm so fascinated by Larry, and thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody, because it's very exciting information.
And for me, again, it's you've helped me tremendously. And you were reading my chart, and my story is that I trained in Europe, and then I came back to the U.S. And interestingly enough, there were two specific states I did not want to go to. One of them was Florida, and the other one was California. And as it turned out, this is where I ended up being, and for right reasons. As I'm now discovering, thanks to you too, more clear what my mission and purpose in life, and also the genesis really of the platform and this radio show as well. And so my question for you is what are the things that you look at to support and assist people to make those decisions when it comes to things like career or relationships or money potential? And where is that dilemma then, if you will, if your one spot in the world is best for the career and another spot is entirely different for a relationship? How does that all work?
Well, that's a great question, and many people spend years learning. In fact, I had several books on my shelf as a teenager and as a college student trying to learn exactly how to answer that question. And it ended up leading me kind of down the path of meeting Tony Robbins and learning that following an expert is the best way to go about learning anything, regardless of the subject. And that's exactly what I did. And what the experts showed me, and it actually is much easier than one would think, is that the angularity of a planet's location can actually help you designate an archetype or a symbol that actually aligns with either who you are or what your personality is like or what you favor. In other words, things you really enjoy doing. So if I'm looking at, let's say, your chart or anyone's, and I'm wanting to understand more about yourself, I begin by looking at congregation or groups of planets, depending on your month of birth and your year of birth, your day of birth, the hour of birth. All of that information comes from the creation of that map I was talking about, or where the planets were located when you were born. And so for yourself, you look at the left-hand side of the chart. For your home or your relationships, you look at the bottom of the chart. For your love life, your partnerships, as it were, you look at the right-hand side. And for your career, you look at the top of the chart. And in some ways, it's mythological in the sense that when we look for inspiration or aspire to reach greater heights, we're literally looking up when we think about those things. So we simply look at the top of the chart for those archetypes to see how they would match. So for your chart in particular, I looked for archetypes that would represent success, prosperity, ease, or elegance, as some people would call it. Everyone has their favorite thing to do, and they're able to do it with grace if they've practiced long enough. Kind of like the old adage where you hear, if you've studied something 20 years, it's like an honorary PhD. So I simply looked for the elements in a chart that would allow you to be as ambitious as you could be and then be rewarded for it. And with you being born in Europe, it's easy to see, even by a first-year student, that there are several planets in what we call a shadow area. In other words, of least expression, as the symbol makers would talk about it. So the idea would be to relocate, change time, as it were, to move those planets from where they were originally on the map and relocate them in a stronger, more beneficial location. And using computers, it's extremely easy to do, and it's accomplished in seconds.
So you help a lot of people with this new awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And let me ask this, what percentage of those people actually make a move according to your predictions or according to your map?
Well, I'd like to think it's a majority, but, everyone always has their own resistance, whether it's a lack of information or uncertainty, or they want, further proof, as it were. And I would think the people with the most resistance are the ones least likely to move. The ones that have relocated, I've found that a majority of them are just ecstatic. It's almost as though they may have already visited a certain location, and I happen to bring it up during the course of conversation. So it's an affirmation at that point that, yes, I enjoyed being in New York, or yes, I enjoyed being in Florida. They remembered from the last time they had visited that location. That's a majority of the people I speak with. On rare occasion, I introduce maybe a location or an area that a person's unfamiliar with, which means they may not immediately move to that area, but they may grow to learn more about it and eventually be persuaded. And again, it really depends on your current situation. There's many people that are, as you've met, are just getting by, and they're okay with that, and that's wonderful. But for those that are trying to find the next level of enjoyment or the next challenge in life, the maps, as it were, that I email to people as I work with them, help them to kind of sit down and have a more informed conversation. It's not as though they're simply taking a chance on relocation. They're literally learning more about their choices, and that's where the level of consciousness changes.
Yeah, and what I like of what you do actually is that you are not strictly a deliverer of a map and a solution for the rest of your life. I know the conversations that I've had with you have been pivotal, and I'm very, very grateful for that, because some of the things that you shared with me in regards to this whole process have made a incredible impact on many of the decisions that I've made. And quite frankly, everyone that I know that you've ever talked to, these friends of mine, they've all moved. And so maybe, these are obviously more conscious beings and, can put it all together so that they can make the smart decisions for themselves. And it's then very exciting, to see the way that they get to change their life. And what's actually interesting in my particular case is that at some point I was quite eager to leave Florida. I'd reached a point, and it was really more for different reasons. And so far that I like the mountains and I like nature, and unfortunately, Florida does not have a lot of that. It's got the ocean, and that's great, but I don't like the alligators and the sharks either. So, but what has helped me is to ensure that, yes, my place is in Florida for a variety of different reasons. One, for my business, but also from the perspective, what you shared with me was about being a speaker, being a teacher. And that also really solidified my current situation as being a speaker and a teacher in the platform that I'm using right now. So not a speaker and a teacher in a traditional form as lectures, and that may come later on. But what's very exciting for me, and also thanks to you, as well as some other things, obviously, is that it helped me make the decision as to what the next phase of my life is all going to be about.
Right. And that's where I think that I've been blessed with continuously asking my own questions, because there's two central philosophies to how to read these maps and charts. There is the Far Eastern method, which is practiced more in Tibet, India, that believe in karma or one's calling, like a soul reading, as if there's this incredible effort made upon our souls to progress in our existence, that there is a hereafter, and in some ways we're preparing for it. And so looking at your chart or looking at a map, helps you to decide the path of least resistance. And then, the Western way of looking at a map and interpreting it, which is very American, if you want to use that phrase, we look at things and look for an advantage. We look for a way to maximize our time here on Earth and take the most of an opportunity. And your chart, Bart, really cries out for variety. And while someone may say, well, in order to have this particular career path, I have to really hyper-focus on one subject and be good at it. And that can be true. But if you have a chart that yearns for variety, and then you move to a location that maximizes a wider variety of opportunities, then you're able to be more of yourself. And maybe you can be one of those people that raises your level of consciousness to the point where you can have your cake and eat it too. That you can learn to manage your time to the point where you can maximize your opportunities and enjoy the variety that your chart cries out for.
And at that very specific point, Larry, is part of what allowed me to get that permission to be me. And it may sound kind of funny, and my entire life, I have been cursed, if you will, with the idea that I couldn't necessarily focus on one thing consistently and all the time. I just had to do multiple things. And it was never an issue of ADD, and people would think, well, he's got ADD and you really shouldn't do this. And everybody's telling me, you just got to focus on one thing that you're good at. And it just never felt right. Mm-hmm. And so that was a major struggle in my life when I was going contrary to what really my, makeup is. And when I talked to you, I was actually quite elated just with that fact. And I like the word multidimensional. And that's exactly how I've been functioning. I do all sorts of different things. And the key point that you helped me understand too, though, is that if I were to go on that route and have my cake and eat it too, and actually I don't even know where that really comes from. It doesn't make sense to me. But the idea that, okay, great, you just have to manage your time really well. You just have to make sure that you are consistently and persistent in all the different areas so that you can maintain this whole complex array of multidimensionality. And that's exactly who I am. And for that fact alone was so freeing and impactful that it's really gave me permission to pursue my path the way that I always thought I needed to. So I want to thank you for that.
You're very welcome. And, and in turn, I thank all the wonderful teachers I've had, over the years. And another thing about your chart in particular, we would talk about the Far Eastern philosophy of discerning what is healthy for you. One of the more advantageous decision makers in your life is when you determine that a particular course or a particular person or a particular subject matter is healthy for you, and it feels good, and it enlivens you. And if you call that a variety, I will certainly agree with you, but I think it helps you to discern more clearly which direction to go. And that's where I enjoy both philosophies, both methods of reading these charts, both the Far Eastern and the Western. They're both helpful.
So another part then is what happens when someone is in the right place for their career, but totally in the wrong place for their relationship. And what kind of advice do you give them?
Well, the first thing I look for is the timing. In other words, is this the time in their life to maximize their career goals? Is this the time in their life to maximize their family goals or their love life? In other words, what is going on? What time period are they in to where they want to focus on one portion of their life or another? And that all plays into their decision making. So I don't make decisions for people. I simply explain to them what period of time they have to be in, and of course that's if they don't already know, and then help them to make their own decision. Help them to see that they have an advantage being in this place, in this time. And if they want to make changes, they certainly can. That's the exciting part of it, is that now with computers, I can present an entire world map. You can look at different countries and different continents and different states if you wanted to stay, let's say, in the United States. And you can find how any change in location can change your focus or change what it is that you want to maximize. You don't have to be just stuck in one place.
Yeah, and that's what's great about modern technology is that, you could be just as effective in one part of the world as in another. And
Right.
obviously, as a plastic surgeon, I'm kind of stuck in one spot. But then again, because of the variety of my life, I'm doing so many different things. And I find myself, traveling quite a bit right now. So I totally forgot what my relationship status was. So going out on a limb here, you want to share, with the listeners where I'm at with that?
Well, let's see. I have to use my computer here. It's not too difficult to just change.
Two things are important for me. One is obviously my career and my purpose and mission in life, which, is I'm so passionate about. But the other part is, we all want, I wouldn't say we all want, but I think life is magnified when you are in a great relationship. And unfortunately, I haven't had the best of luck of that. And so hopefully my future will be improved. So I'm kind of shaking here right now to hear the answer.
Again, a lot of it has to do with timing. And this is actually a difficult time period if we were just going to focus on your love life. In other words, if we took our focus off your career, which is, like I said, going wonderfully well, and we just looked at relationships, your current location and your current time says that, the difficulties have involved understanding boundaries and information as you gather it. In other words, there's a part of you that has a real profound need to be right and need to be informed in a relationship. And that what we talked about earlier, the discernment between who is healthy for you and who is not, presents a certain number of challenges. We would also talk about the time right now being that Saturn, the large ringed planet out there, is actually moving in a position opposite the moon from your birth chart. So literally we would be saying how there's so much focus and so much intensity on your personal needs that this is what we call a barren time. In other words, for you to start a relationship right now, it may be difficult, cumbersome. The other person could see you as almost a codependent person. In other words, they would lean on you too much or you on them too much. So either it's a better time for, let's say, friendship, in other words, where it's not quite so serious, or it's a time for equals, such as friends or business partnerships or a relationship that doesn't have too many expectations. So it's all about the timing. Now, that timing, of course, will change, as we get closer to the springtime of 2016 or springtime in the Northern Hemisphere. Then that emphasis begins to change and things become easier and there's an optimism that grows. And by the time we get to, let's say, May and June, the emphasis will be on easier relationships or meeting someone in the course of your travels. In other words, your perfect partner, as it were, may not actually be in Florida.
And this is what's so fascinating, because if people, were just imagine the freedom that you get, because now you have a clarity of choice, and how relieving that is, because there is, as our human experience evolves, and as we're just in this very moment, we are surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. We are surrounded by a lot of unknowns. And when we have access to more of that certainty, and as you were describing some of these things, I was feeling elated, even though this is a bad time for me to have a relationship. But just the fact that you have that information is just absolutely incredible, and to me, absolutely fascinating.
It is, because, just to add further emphasis upon this time period, it can be a time when you feel alone right now, because it's really your needs that are coming to the forefront. And while you're focusing on what you need in order to feel greater fulfillment and meet other circumstances in your life, it may feel as though there isn't enough time for an ideal relationship. In other words, maybe the focus is so much on career right at the moment and your schedule that scheduling time for an ideal relationship may be difficult. That's temporary, and that can be kind of a side effect in the sense of feeling alone or feeling isolated, because this is time to work on you. In other words, it isn't the perfect time for the perfect relationship right now. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong.
Right. And then again, of course, that's where it becomes totally freeing. Mm-hmm. So my question for you,
sure,
is for any of the listeners who are listening in, what would be the process for them to actually get in touch with you, and what does that pretty much look like? I know what my experience was, which is phenomenal, and I promote it to anybody that I can think of that is interested in this kind of thing. So what would be the process for someone to have a consultation with you, or go to an event? And I know you've got some events coming up.
I do. Let's see, I think there's a couple that are not posted on the website just yet. But I do make frequent appearances at different convention sites or hotels, places where they have public events. And I introduce myself as well as what I do for a short few minutes. And it's more economical, I think, for people to just kind of get their feet wet or get introduced to what I do. But for the most part, just journeying to my website, the LarryMartin.biz, B-I-Z, tells you all about me, allows you to click on consultation, tells you more about what the process is, which really just simply involves you filling out one of the online forms that comes with scheduling an appointment, and, being able to email me or text your birth date, time, and place, and then I'm able to email back to you your own astrology map, your own chart, your own world map, if that's what we're going to discuss, as well as your ability to ask questions. And we set an appointment time. I study your map for a good solid hour, sometimes two, before we talk, and then I record the conversation. That way, you don't have to worry about note-taking or paying too close attention if you don't want to. But having a recording of the session allows you to go back and make references to check me and my accuracy, if you really prefer to do that. To look at the calendar and say, well, this date, this event is taking place. Or I want to be in the right place at the right time, so I'm going to choose this date that we talked about. It's absolutely amazing, I think, how people then have a different perspective, and they take greater responsibility in their decision-making when they have this information. In other words, they don't just act as though they're living life by trial and error. They're actually taking responsibility for their skills or for their talent, and I find that incredibly enlightening and exciting.
And you're talking about, heightening the level of consciousness, and just by having a conversation with you regarding some of the elements that and experiences that actually do show up,
Mm-hmm.
It's really a confirmation also of some of the disturbances that happen within us. And what's interesting is that we sometimes are not even aware of that. And that's why I like, just simply for the fact to have a higher level of awareness of, who we are as an individual, what our archetypes are, as you were discussing some of the things about my relationships. And it's why I like to say to people is that we live in an intelligent universe. Things are not just happening by random. And
Yeah.
however you want to explain it, whether it's rhythms, cycles, energy, harmonics,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, I mean, there is an intelligence. And
Yeah.
and part of the big challenge that we then all have is, as Socrates put it out there, is, you don't know what you don't know. And so it's really about finding out what you don't know about
Right.
you. And like you said, from you're that kind of person that, always ask the question. And I drive people nuts. I always ask them questions. I ask them why am I this and that. I'm still, very much of a kid at heart. But that's where the answers lie. And unless you start asking the questions, you're not, you're going to be living in a dream, and you're not going to be able to make that progress that that you feel that you should have. And
Yeah.
so having that conversation with you,
Mm-hmm.
starting to illustrate and starting to be able to associate, oh yeah, that's me. Oh yeah, that's me too. Oh, I just thought that was a random thing, but that's me too,
Right.
allows someone then to take the next step.
And that's the even I think greater excitement for me as well, is when I have these type of conversations even with friends of mine. Just a few years back, there was a convention where there was just one photographer, and a lot of times it's difficult to get a lot of us in the same room together with our schedules being as they are. And he took a lot of photographs, but then misplaced the film. He misplaced the roll of film. So we had a conversation about whether or not astrological maps could help us find his missing roll of film. And so we didn't have our computers as handy as we have today, but we just literally used our common sense and logic and looked at where the moon was in the sky and came to the deduction that the universe was helping us to locate his film, and that the planets, or the archetypes as they would represent photography, led us to locate the film in either two locations. One was under his hotel bed in his hotel room. The other was in the floor of his car. And so we all ran over to the hotel room. Again, this is not your average conversation of how's the weather. This is really kind of like a treasure hunt. And we get to the hotel room and the film is not there. We go to his car that he had rented, and under the driver's seat was the missing roll of film.
And that's just so unbelievable. And I'm sure enough critics out there who just don't appreciate what it is that you're doing is they're going to say, oh, that's just by chance, or you know what, intuitively you just figured out that that's where
We
it
think the
was,
same way.
or some what.
We're skeptical too. Sure, we're thinking, wow, we don't know if this is going to work, but it does.
But that's the beauty, and the beauty is that there are so many different elements and factors that come to play, and so what you're doing then is you're just opening the door to the different dimensions, if you will, of possibility. And all you have to do, I mean, if you have two doors in this particular case with the film, yeah, well, let's look there. Well, it's not there. Okay, what's the other possibility? Oh, it's here. Well, could be a third possibility. But at least now you've got some information that you can use,
Right.
and then hopefully get the result that you desire. Obviously, if you were to tell me that my career is best in one area, my relationship was best in somewhere else, and it didn't actually happen, well, you know what? There are other factors that are coming into play, or I just didn't realize what the real timing was. And so
Right.
that's what I like about how you approach it. Is this is a conversation of opportunity and possibility that you can just tap then into and live that life more on your terms.
Well, it's no different than predicting the weather or a stock market price. You, first of all, have to gather as much information as possible. And then second, you just eliminate the less probable. In other words, you look at the odds. In other words, you know what the weather is where you're at right now. You know that if you wanted to predict the weather for tomorrow, you'd be fairly accurate. But as you predict further on down the line in time, as you predict maybe a month from now or 3 months from now, your accuracy is going to go down. Astrology operates the same way. As we try to read further into the future, there are more choices and there are more actions and there are more learning and thoughts that allow you to raise your consciousness and make the changes. That's really what we're doing. Is we're not so much predicting the future as much as we are simply understanding the repetition and natural cycles.
And again, that's totally fascinating to me. And when we can look at it from that perspective, it lends a lot of credibility, to this process, and therefore the opportunity, as I've experienced myself, because, once again, living in this world of uncertainty, and there is that tendency that we could have, that we self-doubt ourselves. Are we on the right track? Are we doing the right thing? And then when you get a piece of information that says, no, you're in the right place right now, totally shifts, the intensity of the work that someone can do. And I find that very, very exciting.
Well, it is. It kind of, for instance, the idea of the, terrorist attacks that occurred in Paris back last November. When you looked at the astrology for the event, because as an astrologer, we're constantly monitoring the news and we're looking for different stories that match up with different astrological charts so that we learn from them. And when you see planets in a particular angle, as it were, that look dangerous or shocking or alarming, then we may take greater care and caution as opposed to someone that wasn't paying attention at all, let's say. So it's just another means with which to gather more information.
Yes, it's just another piece of information. So we only have a few minutes left, and just briefly, I'd like to hear from you. Something you mentioned earlier on is, the Egyptians and how the Egyptians looked at, astrology as connected with their biology, and it's also then interesting to note that this was thousands of years ago, and they were so advanced in this science.
Well, they were. They had a greater understanding of our cosmology, to the extent to where when they built and designed the pyramids, they matched them according to the stars in Orion's belt. I even noticed this when, as a 5-year-old, I knew I had to be home by a certain hour during the winter time, and it happened to be right when Orion rose in the east. I knew I had to be home by then or I was in trouble. So there's an interconnection or an understanding of, how the planets and the stars perhaps play a deeper role. The Egyptians then also understood the precession of the equinoxes. They understood that they were in a golden age. And so a lot of people theorize today there was a show called The Pyramid Code. You can find it on Netflix, I believe, that they actually were aware that we would eventually go through a dark age. And so they did what they could energetically to build their temples that mirrored our endocrine system and mirrored different organs in the body. And they would align them a certain way, even utilizing, in theory, electromagnetic fields to try to help us minimize, how long we would spend in the dark ages. The Mayans, designed their calendar according to the motion and movement of the moon. And so they have their, what they call Baktun cycle, which came to an end in December of 2012. It didn't mean the end of society or the end of the world. It just simply meant the end of one cycle and the beginning of a new cycle of enlightenment. So we've hit a crossroads where suddenly now we are looking at the world as being inclusive, friendly, connected or interconnected. And we haven't really thought that way in several hundreds of years. So,
and on that note, I do want to wrap up. There's that opportunity to see what our future is for us as we go into a new age. And I really want to thank you, Larry. I plan on having more conversations with you on social media. But I am Dr. Bart Rademacher, Prescription for Your Transformation, talking to Larry Martin, Astrology, and it's www.larrymartin.biz. And thank you for joining, and thank you for tapping into your intelligence. I'm Dr. Bart Rademacher.
Thanks for listening to Dr. Rademacher's Prescription for Transformation. Join Dr. Bart Rademacher live right here on Radio Star Worldwide each week or on demand 24/7.